Recording in
Recording.
Okay.
We're the only ones here.
Stay on the shot.
Okay. It's a grainiest video. It is not a great camera on this. Also, the light in here is not great either.
No,
so
it's not.
maybe if I sat on the other side, but I figured no one wanted to see a door behind me. So.
Well, that's true.
Actually going to. All right, so, okay, thank you for joining us tonight, everybody, for another great presentation at the Ames Free Library. We're so thrilled to be welcoming Caroline Ailanthus, who is primarily a science writer, but her fiction blends science and story. Caroline is also the author of the Climate and Emergency blog, an Ecological Memory. The book she will be talking about tonight is her second published novel. She grew up in Delaware and attended various small odd schools, mostly in New England, which as a small, odd, old library, we can appreciate. And she earned her BA in environmental leadership and a master's in environmental studies. She is joining us tonight from Maryland, where she lives with her husband and assorted animals. So Caroline, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. I should say my notes have gone unresponsive for some reason, so hopefully they will come back, but I have this, it will be all right. Okay, also before we start, will somebody please, right now I can see a library gargoyle and I can see people's names. I need to be able to see somebody's face so I can talk to. So can somebody please make themselves visible? That would be really good. There you are. Excellent. Thank you. Yeah. So and there you are. Thank you for coming. My name is Caroline Ailanthus, and we are here to discuss my book, Ecological Memory. Now, a couple of years ago, I published this book on loss and resiliency in the aftermath of a terrible global pandemic. And then we had an actual terrible global pandemic, which is not what I wanted to happen, but it did have the advantage of letting me see how my fiction compares to something oddly close to the real thing. I will introduce you to the book and to the characters, and then we'll dive right in. There'll be plenty of time for questions and discussions afterwards. Start by reading the I'm sorry, I'm fighting with my notes as I'm doing this, which is not optimal, but you know, you write about a global pandemic, weird things happen. It's just the way it is. I'll read you the blurb on the back of the book first, and then the first few pages. Elsie Rodriguez still can't remember how or where she survived the fall of civilization. It's been 20 years. All she has now is a few memories of the trees she played among as a child. Fortunately, Elsie is apprenticed to the brilliant and mysterious itinerant ecologist, Andy Coten. If anyone can figure out where the forest of her memory grew, he can. But Andy, too, is lost. When the old civilization fell, his son vanished. Now he has questions he can neither answer nor let go. In helping Elsie reclaim her home, can Andy, too, find peace? Part scientific detective story, part post-apocalyptic travelogue, Ecological Memory is, at heart, a tale about what happens after you lose everything. Chapter 1. What What's it like having hair growing out of your face? Elsie asked as she watched her ecology professor shave in the shade of a hemlock grove. He paused and looked at her. You have hair growing out of your face, he said. You should know what it's like. Elsie's cheeks grew hot and she looked away. She was sensitive about her few chin hairs. But Andy didn't insult and he rarely teased. He probably just meant her eyebrows. She turned back and watched him shave again. He let her watch, ignoring her gaze, as distant and professional as if they sat in his classroom back on campus. She felt safe with him. She didn't know why. She never played the little kid except with him, but she couldn't tell if he liked or merely tolerated the act. Without his white stubble, he looked younger, but Elsie could not guess his age. Personally, he remained a mysterious blank. Professionally, she knew he was impressive. Dr. Andrew Cote was one of the few scientists left from before the pandemic, and unlike a lot of survivors, he hadn't left his old career behind. Instead, he and a very few colleagues had fought to save data and scientific literature from failing computers, and then spent years reweaving professional networks and academic systems. 20 years later, he was still at it, crisscrossing the country on foot every summer. She planned to be an environmental educator, not a researcher, but she'd asked him to sponsor her application to the professional guilds anyway. Nobody knew more than he did about how science functioned as a human community, and nobody was better than him at explaining how to work with people. That, and she admired his simple, fearless doggedness. Everything else was a matter of rumor. People said he'd lost his wife and children in the pandemic, but of course a lot of people had. It was his refusal to discuss his family that lifted common tragedy to mythic status. Opinions split over whether he had remarried. Elsie had noticed, traveling with him, that he recorded video messages to someone every night on his little tablet computer. He didn't know she knew. She had overheard him once, just the tone of his voice, soft and gentle, and she had resolved to never overhear again. She'd defend him from anyone, if necessary, even from her own curiosity. She never asked him if the rumors were true. She did once ask him to explain what 10% survival rate really meant in human terms. Andy had knelt beside her and asked her to put out her hands. She'd laid them, all 10 fingers, on the cool brown needles of the forest floor. The man drew his pocket knife and brought it down, hard, on her left pinky. Of course he didn't cut her, but it took all her will not to flinch. He repeated the motion with each of her other fingers, and each time she felt a thrill of fear and the impression of the knife blade lingering on her skin. When he had mimed cutting off all her fingers but one, he folded away his knife and caught up the one surviving finger, her left pinky, in his own warm hand and gave it a friendly little shake. Now live the rest of your life like this, he said. Now, obviously, their pandemic is different than ours. Theirs and civilization, something that ours has never seriously threatened, at least not yet. Now, the best way for me to explain what their pandemic is like is to let Andy explain it. I should say that the reason why in this scene he and Elsie are sharing a room is because it's the only room left in the inn where they're staying. This section is a little bit long. I'm going to read all of it, though, because it includes some important character development and world building stuff, too. So that'll give you more of a sense of what the book is about. This left Elsie and Andy nothing to do but retreat to their single room. Elsie wasn't especially attracted to Andy. She assumed he reciprocated her non-interest. But she couldn't ask him. He was her teacher, and he was some unknown but large number of 2 years too old for her anyway. The subject was closed. The sense of the forbidden, plus not actually knowing for sure, gave the whole situation an ambiguity that could have been sexy and exciting with the right person. But with Andy, it was just awful. In the dark, she could hear him shifting around in bed. He seemed uncomfortable with the arrangement too. She wanted to do something to reassure him, to dial back the ambiguity at least a little bit. "Tell me a story," she said in her little girl's voice. "I don't know any stories," he confessed. "I used to have to read to my daughter instead. I couldn't make anything up." "That's okay. I don't know any stories except my own. That's the one I want to hear. It's not a great bedtime story. Tell it to me anyway." And this time, to her surprise, he did. Andy had indeed been uncomfortable. He knew there were men in his position who took advantage, and he didn't like to think that Elsie might fear him. But he felt no ambiguity, no attraction. She was just too young. If Sarah were still alive, she'd be about the same age. When he'd spoken of reading just now, he'd been thinking of Sarah, not his living daughter. He did not ask himself why. And so, when the girl asked, he gave in without thought, without caution, and gave her a bedtime story. The first thing that came to mind was the scent of the desert. The Sonoran Desert doesn't smell like anything else. It doesn't smell like a beach, although the soil is often sandy. Nor is the scent exactly explained by its mix of plants, though they do contribute. If it rains anywhere within miles, you can smell the creosote bushes come alive. A scent like an eastern hemlock grove, only more so, flows along most watercourses, the perfume of invasive tamarisk trees. The cloying aroma of desert willow could distract a hiker in April. But underneath all of that is something else, something delicate. Andy thought it might be the local mix of soil bacteria, but whatever it was 20 years later, when he cast his memory back, the scent was the first thing to greet him. "When the pandemic came," he began, "I was out west, alone in the desert, working. I got the news online." "How could you get online in the middle of the desert?" "There were cell phone towers everywhere. There were a lot of people back then, so there were a lot of cell phone towers. We had almost universal coverage there at the end." "Wow, okay, go on." "So on the news, there was just something about some measles cases in New York. Measles was rare, but not unheard of. No big deal. The strange thing was, a few days later, they said these people had already been vaccinated. The vaccine hadn't protected them. So the pandemic was measles? Nobody told me that before." When Elsie spoke, he saw their small, darkened room around him. When he replied, he was back in the desert. The shift was jarring. He let himself slip back into his story again. "No, see, that's the thing. Measles isn't like the flu, where you need a new vaccine for every strain. With measles, the part of the virus that triggers the immune response doesn't mutate. If you're resistant to one strain, you're resistant to all of them, or it isn't measles. This wasn't measles. The symptoms were similar, but not identical. The biggest difference was that with the pandemic, pneumonia wasn't just a rare complication. It was an inherent part of the disease. That's why so many people died. They came up with a name for the thing, some acronym, but it never caught on. We called it the pandemic, same as now. Anyway, a few days after that, they said the same thing. A measles-like pneumonia was spreading in other cities around the world. London, Melbourne, Sao Paulo, there were a lot of places. But it wasn't that the other cities had caught it from New York. As far as anybody could tell, they'd actually all gotten the disease at the same time. It just took a week or so for somebody to figure out the news stories in different countries matched. Wait, multiple cities all at once? Was this thing on purpose? Yeah, probably, but nobody ever proved it. Nobody even settled on a really good motive. The people who did it are probably all dead by now. That's horrible. Well, yes, it's a horrible story. Do you want me to tell it? Yes, please. Sorry. The thing is, only a few dozen people were even sick yet. We'd had pandemic scares before, but they never really amounted to anything. As weird as this one was, I figured the public health people would just take care of it. Civilization seemed really remote to me that winter, and I had a lot to do. I had to map out potential bat roosts and nectar sources so I'd know where to put my interns during the spring migration. I didn't know they were underestimating the scope of the disease. The public health services, I mean. A lot of people were misdiagnosed who just never sought help. And for the first week or so, there were no obvious symptoms. So you just felt tired, maybe ran a light fever. Nothing you'd go to a doctor about, but you were already contagious. So however many people the CDC knew were sick, there were always many more. And those extra people each infected an average of 10 more. So when the authorities tried to contain the disease, it was already outside the container. We never had a chance, but we didn't know. So I just kept doing my job. When I went into town for another month or so of groceries, I noticed people were freaking out, but that always happened with pandemic warnings. So I ignored it and went back out. But then my wife called me. She said the mystery disease, the pandemic, she said it was in Boston. It was in a lot of cities by then, Chicago, LA, Dallas, anywhere with a major airport. But we lived in Keene, right near Boston. And there were little satellite infections springing up in smaller cities and towns all over. Everywhere they screened, they found the pandemic already there. But she didn't call to tell me all that. She'd assumed I already knew. She called to tell me not to worry about her, that she and the kids were fine, that I should stay out in the desert like a reverse quarantine for as long as I could, so I wouldn't get infected. She'd heard the disease was in Tucson, right near me. She wanted me to stay safe. What did you say? I said, F that. What do you think I'd say? I wasn't going to let my family face this thing without me. So I packed up my stuff and drove to Phoenix. I was going to catch a plane, get back east. But I got to Phoenix and there were no planes. They just imposed a travel ban that day a few hours before I got there. The airport was full of people. There were still planes landing, but nobody was allowed to take off and everyone was shouting and waving money around. It was insane. I remember sitting at the airport trying to figure out what to do, watching the TV there, all about the emergency measures. And then my cell phone rings and I'm sorry, this is just, I know, your wife, I'm sorry. And my daughter, I'm really sorry. Thanks, Andy said. He remembered for a moment, not sadness, which he had no time for back then, but simply how surreal everything was. How the president on TV calmly discussing the imminent end of civilization with the pandemic rash already on his face had seemed no more remarkable than the giant airplanes coming in to land outside. Neither had looked quite real. His wife must have lied to him, he thought. She must have lied. He repeated the same thought over and over, unable to focus well enough to finish with one idea and go on to the next. They just said on the news, they just said 2 to 4 days survival from the onset of definitive symptoms. But he talked with her that morning and she said she was fine. She and the kids were fine. She must have been lying. She tried to save his life, the last thing she did. And she'd failed because here he was in the middle of tens of thousands of probably contagious people, all for nothing. But he would not cry with Elsie. I couldn't help my wife and daughter, but my son was still out there. I didn't know where he was. The man who contacted me said my son was at our neighbor's house, but when I called, the phone just went to voicemail. Same thing with most of our other friends in the area. Most of them were probably sick already. The few I could get a hold of had left town, so nobody could help me look for my boy. I tried the police, but they didn't seem to think a missing 8-year-old was an emergency. They thought I just couldn't find my babysitter's phone number or something. I couldn't explain it right. They were polite to me. I could have killed someone. I had to go back east and look for him myself. But I couldn't get a permit to get through the roadblocks. I started looking for ways to smuggle myself through, but somebody stole my supplies out of the back of my truck, and I couldn't replace it all at once. They were rationing food and gas so people wouldn't drive across the country. I hoarded what I needed a little at a time. Days went by, a week. Everything was just ridiculously difficult. Things in Phoenix were falling apart. It wasn't that everybody was dying. Only a few dozen people in the city were even sick yet. No, the problem was fear. People mobbed stores, buying up face masks, vitamin C, and duct tape as if that would help. They bought up hand sanitizer, but that was just alcohol gel, and alcohol doesn't kill viruses, only bacteria. There were public dispensers for it all over the place anyway. People just weren't thinking. At the time, someone At any time someone would show up on the street with what looked like the rash, even if it was just a sunburn, everybody would panic. And some looked for someone to blame. You said you thought the pandemic might have been deliberately created. So did we, but we didn't know who. So some people guessed. It was a government conspiracy. It was the Chinese. It was the Arabs. It was white people. It was Mexicans. Mexicans? Oh, sure. There was a lot of tension because of the perceived competition for jobs between Anglos and Latinos, especially in the Southwest. And there were always people in this country who didn't like immigrants. Yeah, my mother told me that. Her parents brought her here when she was little without papers. Go on. The most ridiculous idea I heard was that Muslim terrorists from Syria or Iran had invented the virus and were smuggling it into the US inside infected, undocumented Mexican immigrants. Guys went out into the desert with guns. You know, it's funny, when I was your age, we were all obsessed with zombies. I don't know why. There were movies and books and stupid little games on the internet all about the zombie apocalypse. And then it actually happened. We were all the Walking Dead running around in desperate need of brains. But I still thought I was going to get out. I was going to be an exception. I was going to find some way through and go find my boy. Then I started coughing. I looked in the mirror and the rash looked back at me. On some level, I knew the pandemic wasn't a death sentence. Lots of people recovered. The real mortality was from what happened later. But I wasn't thinking survival statistics. I was thinking, that's it. I failed. I'm dead. I wasn't going to make it to New Hampshire. Even with a car, the trip took almost a week. The hospitals were overloaded by then, and they couldn't do much for you anyway. So I got in my truck and I headed north to the Grand Canyon to wait. I figured if I was going to die, I might as well do it somewhere pretty away from the crowds. But then my stupid truck broke down on the way. I was starting to feel really bad at that point, really sick. And I thought, this is great. Here I'm about to die on the shoulder of the damn interstate. So I rigged up my tarp for shelter and privacy and crawled into the back of my truck, got in my sleeping bag and waited. Everything hurt. I couldn't breathe well. But the worst thing, I was bored. I couldn't sleep or even daydream because of the pain and because I was out of my head with fever. Time passed, I don't know how much. Then the fever broke. Breathing got a little easier. I sat up and it was like the fog had cleared. The virus was gone. But my lungs still felt awful. My truck still wouldn't start. My sleeping bag was soiled, just soaked. So I figured I was going to die of exposure. I'd gotten up, got myself cleaned up and dressed, and I was trying to figure out what the hell I was going to do when, I'm not kidding, 3 guys I know come riding up on horseback, and Andy suddenly realized that Elsie hadn't asked a question in a while. He listened to her silence and concluded she was asleep. He tried not to feel slighted, but there was no way he was going to get to sleep himself. He hadn't thought about these things in a long time. The way the desert smelled, the sounds of the riots in Phoenix, the cold, hard feeling of being sure he was about to die. And before all of that, how it felt not to be a widower. He'd forgotten that one. He felt all jazzed up, ready for battle, but there was no one to fight, nothing to do in the silent house of sleeping friends. He got up and went to the bathroom and then walked down to the common room, sat in the dark at the empty bar, and turned on his tablet. He hadn't meant to share so much. He planned to talk about his experience of the pandemic, not himself, but the two had proved inseparable. He had not been able to stop the feelings from coming up. And when Elsie somehow knew or guessed that his wife had died, he'd been unable to deny it. He had managed to keep some things back, like the story of what had happened to his parents and brother. But those things and images too were all stirred up in his mind anyway. Should he have shared any of his story? He told himself that Elsie had needed to hear it and would need to hear at least an edited version of the rest, that he was giving her what her parents couldn't or wouldn't. She had a right to know where her world came from. So what if there were things he'd rather not think of ever again? Her need trumped his. But he also scolded himself that he'd had no right to tell her, that she hadn't even really wanted him to, that she'd just been going through her stupid little kid routine for whatever reason, and he burdened her with his tale out of a selfish need for catharsis. Maybe he thought about nothing in particular. Mostly he thought about nothing in particular at all, just waited for exhaustion and the mindless rhythm of computer solitaire to calm him. By the time he returned to his room, the moon, waning towards half, had risen high enough to shine across the roofs of the buildings on the other side of the street and in at the window. Its light shone on Elsie, sleeping with her mouth open, and her dark braids splayed out all over the pillow. She looked very young. The moonlight reminded him of streetlights, the once ubiquitous sodium glow of another age, another house, another girl. He put out his hand to stroke the hair of the sleeping woman, but didn't complete the gesture. He put his hand away and went back to bed. My notes are behaving now, so I need to advance them. So I didn't actually set out to write about a pandemic. I wanted to write about the end of civilization and what happens afterwards. And I needed a thing that could destroy civilization. So I picked a horrible disease. But if I'm going to write about something, I want to do it right. I wanted virologists to be able to read the story and not, start twitching. So I read up on how infectious diseases spread, and I thoroughly picked the brain of a very generous virology student a friend introduced me to. I created an imaginary disease and its sweep through humanity, and I made educated guesses about how humanity would respond. When life began to imitate art, it was eerie. Friends who had already read the book contacted me, a bit freaked out. It seemed at times as though I'd predicted the future. I hadn't. I'd simply listened to experts when they said what we were vulnerable to. And what characteristics a disease would have to have in order to become a serious pandemic. For example, we've seen how when there's an Ebola outbreak or a dangerous new flu strain, anything like that, health officials the world over are pretty quick to notice and jump into action. When a new disease pops up in a rural place, as most new diseases do, rural places are by definition isolated, so they can usually get the outbreak contained before it spreads. So a pandemic, something that is not contained, is much more likely to start in a city. Similarly, you might think that the worst case scenario is something like Ebola because it's just so horrific. But actually, because Ebola has such a high mortality rate and it's not that infectious, outbreaks are really easy to keep track of and relatively easy to contain. I mean, you're not going to have an Ebola outbreak in your village and not notice. Far worse would be a highly contagious disease that sometimes has mild symptoms or none at all. Something like that can spread under the radar, and it would be impossible to contain, especially if it starts in the city. And even a relatively low mortality rate becomes catastrophic if enough people get sick. Now, my fictional pandemic is much more contagious than COVID is, and it has a higher mortality rate than COVID does, about 20%. But still, in these broad outlines, the diseases are similar, but of course they're similar. They have to be. If COVID weren't similar, it wouldn't have become a pandemic. But as I said, the fictional disease is worse in certain key respects. Now, having spent a couple of years imagining disaster, I might have let myself get really upset, really panicked by COVID when it happened, except that my years imagining disaster had been very closely linked to science. And the advantage of being a stickler for realism is that when life imitates art, you stay a little bit more grounded. And you know, civilization isn't, you know what's not going to destroy civilization. Now, creating a plausible disease was one thing. Figuring out how society would respond was something else. You have to remember, and it's weird to think of now, when I wrote this book, there was almost nobody alive anymore who had been through anything like this. The closest historical comparable would be the 1918 flu pandemic. So I had to make stuff up because we didn't know. We really didn't know. I guessed correctly about increased xenophobia and blaming. I guessed correctly that there would be panic buying, although I thought it would be duct tape, not toilet paper, that flew off the shelves. There are other things I got right too, but I overestimated the tendency to riot. I missed the way many people would pull together. I completely missed social distancing. And although the fictional disease, like the real one, is much worse for anyone with underlying health problems and for people without access to good medical care, I didn't realize how that would translate into racial disparities. I should have gotten that one. I really should have. Basically, I was just naive. Honestly, I probably still am naive. So I started writing with a couple of goals in mind. One of my goals was to explore the way scientists experience science as an everyday thing in the shared frame of reference. But I knew that most of my readers would not be scientists. So how do I make something seem normal to people it isn't normal to? Part of the solution I developed was to have Andy and Elsie use their shared frame of reference, ecology, to talk about a familiar subject, human interaction. I'm going to read you an example of them doing that. If this were a movie, she said in a dreamy voice, you'd turn out to actually be my real father. She was lying on her belly, chin in hand, kicking her feet idly. She was being 10 again. Andy looked up from his book a moment. I think I'd know, he said dryly. Elsie was about to point out that being a man who might not, a man could father a child and not know, when she realized what such a comment would imply about his character. She shut her mouth. I'd also know, he added, as though he could read her mind, if there was a possibility I might not know. Elsie's face reddened and she looked away. She would not apologize for thinking, however embarrassing the thought. Anyway, she didn't mean that Andy was her dad, only that in a movie he would be, because movies are like that. He wasn't even her father figure, not exactly. She didn't know what Andy was to her or what she was to him. She didn't even know for sure if she was important to him at all. The silence stretched out for a while. I have some articles on insect host plant choices, Andy said finally. If you want me to send them to you too? Sure. Somehow she had started to specialize in insects and how they interacted with human communities. She was researching now for a series of more in-depth workshops on the subject. You know, Andy began conversationally, there is, or at least used to be, a community of urban butterflies in the Northwest that aren't using any of the remaining native plants there. They are completely dependent on exotics in people's gardens. It's what's called a novel ecosystem, species that didn't evolve together but form a functional community anyway. If you got everybody to grub up those exotics and replant with natives, what would happen to those butterflies? Elsie happened to be looking away from him as he spoke, so she allowed herself to roll her eyes fondly. In her workshop, she often stated authoritatively that non-native plants are inedible to native insects, and so starve insect-eating birds, that living things need their evolutionary partners, the species they have grown up with, so to speak, to survive. So, naturally, Andy had found a counterexample. He liked to do that. Questions interested him far more than certainty. She made an interested noise. Relationships between organisms that do not share evolutionary history might not be as nuanced or specialized, he continued, addressing the back of her head, but sometimes they are enough. Elsie turned to face him, surprised, but his expression was unreadable. Something inside her softened at his words, but she wasn't sure whether it should have. Everything he said could be understood on more than one level, and she never knew which he actually meant and couldn't imagine asking. But then an odd thing happened when I was writing scenes like that. See, I'm a very visual writer. I see these things happening like a movie in my head, and then I write down what I watched. And so writing dialogue, it feels like a process of taking dictation almost. And my characters sometimes say things that they're like, wow, I hadn't thought of it that way at all. And so when I was writing this one scene, Andy said something and he made a connection. And all of a sudden I realized that I needed to rewrite half the book because this was a real theme of the story. This was what the book was about. So I'm going to read you that scene. I should explain what's happening in here is that Andy and Elsie are having lunch on a ferry boat. It is good, Andy pronounced. Does it actually taste like fried oysters? Sort of, Elsie replied, a little. You've never had oysters? No. He obviously thought the answer self-evident. Have you ever broken Jewish dietary laws? I break some of them often, but the laws I do follow, I haven't broken those since I wrote East the first time. Why not? Why follow some laws and not others? I don't know. You're like my mother, Elsie commented and took a bite of her roll. Excuse me? You're religious the same way. She says I was christened and she crosses herself sometimes, but she didn't object when I didn't want to be confirmed. She only goes to mass on Christmas and Easter. I don't think she prays anymore. So she's like you. She's religious out of habit. Andy leaned back and folded his arms over his chest. In my case, it's a little more than that, he said after a pause. I'm Jewish because my mother was Jewish. She was because of her parents. One of my grandfathers had the numbers, on his arm. If I assimilate, if I start thinking and acting like everybody else, then for what did they survive? Why did they come here to America, if not for me to be able to live as a Jew here? And he went back to eating his roll. The boat started moving again with a small jolt. Elsie exhaled, blowing the hair out of her face. She was used to the shadow of the pandemic, but this, she'd read about the Holocaust in books. She never thought to find its legacy sitting across a table from her sharing a basket of fries. Your family has been through 2 tragedies then, she said. I hadn't thought of that. Everybody goes through something. It's like hurricanes, she said after some thought. Oh? Yeah. The Great September Gale, the hurricane of 1938, Tropical Storm Irene, Hurricane Odette. You told me how to find signs from all of them. But those scars don't mar the landscape, do they? They create it. What you're talking about is disturbance history, Andy told her. Say, fire. People look at wildfire, they think it's the end of the world. And as he spoke, he noticed he had a blob of ketchup on the back of his left hand. It looked almost like blood. He put his roll down and used his ketchup hand as a sort of a palette, daubing a violently red spot in the middle of the table with his right index finger. And it is the end of the world, he continued, if your world happens to be encompassed by the particular patch that burned. Animals and plants die in fire. Sometimes people do. That loss is very real, but it is local in both place and time. If you pull back, if you look at the bigger scale, you see there are lots of little burn patches in various stages of recovery. He began dotting the table with lots of little ketchup blobs. Pull back far enough and you see the fires are just part of a larger complex pattern, like the log patches in the mountains, if you remember. He surveyed his work and Elsie laughed to see it. He'd made a rather crooked and pointless smiley face. Now, notice his line. And it is the end of the world if your world is the patch that burned. The loss is very real. The larger pattern he describes doesn't make tragedy not tragic. He knows better than that. He lost family members to the pandemic, and his grandfather lost family to the Holocaust. There is no planet on which things like that are not just awful, but he's an ecologist. And the idea of apparent contradiction between scales is very important in some forms of ecology. What's going on is at a small scale can appear to be the exact opposite of what's going on at a large scale. And yet both are real and in fact both interact with each other. So we're not using an analogy here. It's not like, let's pretend human beings are ecosystems. Rather, the discipline of ecology provides a certain perspective on how systems work. Ecosystems are systems, but so are human societies and even human minds. So studying ecology gives you a way of thinking about all sorts of things beyond ecology. And maybe that kind of perspective helps Andy to cope. It can help other people cope too. I'm not saying that everybody needs to go study ecology. I'm not saying that insights gained through science are necessarily the best way to cope with the slings and arrows of fate. I'm just saying that Andy's source of perspective and comfort is another example of something I covered in fiction that I later found out applies in real life too. I know that because right after I published Ecological Memory, my sister died. She didn't die of COVID, she had cancer. But the point is that there is no planet on which her death or the death of any loved one is anything other than awful. Knowing there is a larger world, a larger pattern, doesn't take that away. But being able to regard both scales as equally and wholly real does make the scale that hurts a little easier to deal with. But I don't want you to think that my book is nothing but science, tragedy, and beautifully described landscapes. Before we close, I want to read you one more excerpt. In the morning after breakfast, she and Andy headed back towards Homestead across wet ground under a sky as gray as glue. The air still felt damp. A fitful breeze spat cold at them now and then. Is it just that we're so much farther north than I'm used to, or is this cold for April? Elsie asked. It's within the range of normal, I'd say, replied Andy, looking at the sky. You know, I can remember snow on the ground in April around here, a couple of inches. Did you have to walk uphill both ways to school too? She teased him. She knew perfectly well that he was right. The climate had been colder, but older people always said that sort of thing, and true or not, it has become a cliche. He laughed. He had a wonderfully boyish laugh, like a grin that had boiled over, showing a row of tiny, well-spaced teeth. Did you know there's a stretch of the Appalachian Trail that actually is uphill both ways? He asked. Yeah? Yeah, well, on average anyway. The trail goes up and down a lot, and he made zigzag motions in the air with his hand and his finger. How do you figure? Okay, so the highest point on the Appalachian Trail is on top of Clingman's Dome in Tennessee, right? Okay, agreed Elsie. She didn't actually know the relative elevation of the various Appalachian peaks, but she had no reason to doubt Andy. So, since Clingman's Dome is higher than the northern terminus at Mount Katahdin in Maine, a northbound hiker averages downhill from Clingman's Dome on. Okay. Well, the lowest point on the trail is at the Hudson River crossing. That was the lowest point on the whole trail. They'd followed that section on the AT on their way north from Pennsylvania. Yeah, it all averages uphill from there. But since the Hudson crossing is north of Clingman's Dome, that section is already averaging downhill for a northbound hiker. So the section of trail from the Hudson River to Mount Katahdin is both uphill and downhill if you're heading north, and is therefore uphill both ways. Brilliant. Is thinking of things like that what geniuses normally do in their spare time? Well, we could try to take over the world, but that usually takes money. Now, before we open it up to questions, just a few announcements. Does the library have a copy of the book?
I will double check the catalog. I do believe we had one on order, but I will double check that.
Okay. So feel free to borrow the book from the library. I like libraries. If you want to buy your own copy, I'm on Amazon. You go to my publisher's website. I have links on my website to all of that. If you want a signed copy, shoot me an email and we'll work something out. I have copies that I can send and we can do that. I'll put my email address and my website in the chat. If you do read my book and you like it, and I think you will, please do me a huge favor and give me a review on Amazon. The thing, you don't need to have bought my book from Amazon to do that, although you do need to have bought something from Amazon. The thing is that the more reviews a book has, the more people Amazon shows it to. So, and the review doesn't have to be something worthy of being published in the New York Times. You can literally just go write, I liked it, and give me a couple of stars. It is a really simple thing that you can do to help me or really any other author, and to help anybody else who wants to read the book. I see somebody wants to buy a signed copy. I'll put my email address in the chat, shoot me an email, and we'll work it out. And there it is. Oh, that worked as a direct message. I want everybody to be able to see it. I'll do that again. There we go. Of course, I don't know how many everybody is. I think. So let's chat. Does anybody have questions, comments, answers?
I will take facilitator privilege and take first question. You touched on this a little bit when you were talking earlier about, when COVID hit and, your friends were like, hey, did you predict the future? And, the things you felt that you got right and wrong. In retrospect, after having personally lived through a pandemic now, are there things that you would, if you were writing this book now, that you would do a little bit differently or that you would change?
Yes. And in fact, there are sequels in the works.
Okay.
And the next one in this, some of the other sequels also have scenes set in the pandemic.
Okay.
They don't run, the sequels aren't set up to run entirely sequentially. And I am changing the way I describe the pandemic. One thing that I have to change that is simply a bow to the way history has turned out. In this book, I use the word pandemic as a shorthand for the entire societal collapse. And I realize that I need to stop doing that because people are, from here on out, people are going to see the word pandemic and think COVID. So I've had to change the language that I use. But more to the specifics of your question, I as I said, I underestimated the tendency of people to come together. And I also didn't realize that what social unrest problems might occur would be embedded in pre-existing problems. You know, that people wouldn't riot because they were just scared of a disease. They might riot because they had bought into a conspiracy theory connected with the disease, or there were some other problem, or some other pre-existing social fault line had been triggered. So in the later books, I am talking more about that. I'm including some of the sort of really beautiful stuff that happens when a people is in crisis, in addition to the ugly stuff. And I'm putting the ugly stuff more in context. Both of those are changing.
Awesome.
Anything else?
I do have one other question.
Have as many as you like.
Okay. Because you write so beautifully, and I am just curious, because obviously you're passionate about both science and writing. So I'm wondering, kind of in your background and in your history, which one of those came for you first? Did the writing come first and science informed it, or did your love of science come first and then kind of turned towards writing?
They both developed together, although not in lockstep. There have been times in my life when one or the other has been dominant. But you know, my first hero was David Attenborough. My first idea of what I wanted to do when I grew up was be like him. I didn't realize at the time that he's basically a writer. But at the same time, if you look, I mean, some of the drawings that have been saved from when I was a really little kid, before I knew how to write, I would get my mother to take dictation and write on the drawings to explain what was happening. And it's clear from those records that what I was doing was I was illustrating stories. Mm-hmm. So I was a writer before I could write. And I've always been fascinated by both.
Wonderful. And you'd actually already answered my other question, because I was going to ask also what was coming next from you, but since you're working on sequels, we know that we can be looking forward to those.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yes. The one that's next up on deck, I'd actually hoped to have it out already, but it's been fighting me. Writers are weird. You have to understand this. You know, not only do we take dictation from imaginary people, we also have arguments with books. And the book always wins, always. If you have an argument with your book, the book will win. And the sooner you can admit that and give it what it wants, the better it will be for everybody. And I finally figured out what was going on. I was trying to write more than one book at the same time. So the next one is going to be a collection of short stories and novellas.
Okay. Wonderful.
Because, you know, that ended up with it. But I was fighting with it for several years.
It happens.
It does.
Okay, well, I don't have any more questions. I don't know if anybody else joining us this evening has any questions. I think that is it. So I will give everybody a few minutes of their evening back. And thank you again, Caroline, so much for joining us and for sharing. We're so happy to have hosted you and to have gotten to hear your story and hear more from you.
All right, and Claire and Brendan, do email me.
Yeah, we will. For sure, I wrote it down. Thank you so much. I can't wait to read it, the whole thing.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right.
All right, thank you so much. Oh, I think they just signed up.